This is Tom Doody, middle-aged American living in New Jersey near the Lincoln Tunnel. If you were to visit my website, you would type Howdy Doody into Google. You'll find the correct spelling of the famous puppet. You then combine Tom Doody in a Google search for my site. Goldman's Programmer, Vanity Fair, September 2013, by Michael Lewis. Part 3. At that moment, at least on the surface, he had the sort of life people are said to come to America for. He'd married a pretty fellow Russian immigrant and started a family with her. They bought a 2-bedroom red brick house in Clifton, New Jersey, and traded up to a 3-bedroom Cape-style house in Little Falls. They had a circle of Russians they called their friends. On the other hand, all Serge did was work, and his wife had no real clue what that work involved. They weren't actually all that close to each other. He did not encourage people to get to know him well, nor did he exhibit a great deal of interest in getting to know them. He was acquiring a lot of possessions in which he had very little interest. The lawn in Clifton was a fair example of the general problem. When he'd gone hunting for his first house, he'd been enamored by the idea of having his own lawn. In Moscow, such a thing was unheard of. But the moment he had one, he regretted it. A pain in the butt to mow. A Russian writer named Serge Aleynikov, who knew Aknos Aleynikovs as well as anyone, thought Serge an exceptionally intelligent, gifted, but otherwise typical Russian computer programmer, whom technical problems became an excuse not to deal with the messy world around him. All of Serge's life before him, he got into prison, was some kind of mirage, he says, or a dream. He was not sure of things. He liked slender girls who loved to dance. He married a girl who managed to have 3 kids in her house before he figured out he doesn't really know her. He was working his ass off, wouldn't spend the money he was making. He would come home and she cooked him vegetarian dishes. He was basically served. And then Wall Street called. Goldman Sachs put Serge through a series of telephone interviews and brought him in for a long 3-day face-to-face interview. These he found extremely tense, even a bit weird. I was not used to seeing people put so much energy into evaluating other people, he said. One after another, a dozen Goldman employees trying to stump him with brain teasers, computer puzzle, math problems, and even some light physics. It must have become clearer to Goldman, as it was to Serge, that he knew more about most of those things than the people asking him. At the end of the first day, Goldman invited him back for a second day. He went home and thought it over. He wasn't all that sure he wanted to work for Goldman Sachs, but the next morning he had a competitive feeling. He said, I should conclude it and try to pass it because it's a big challenge. He'd been surprised to find that in at least one way he fit in. More than half the programmers at Goldman's were Russian. Russians had a reputation for being the best programmers on Wall Street, and Serge thought he knew why. He had been forced to learn programming without the luxury of endless computer time. In Russia, time on a computer was measured in minutes, he says. When you write a program, you are given a tiny time slot to make it work. Consequently, we learned to write code in a way to minimize the amount of debugging. And so you had to think about it a lot before you committed it to paper. The ready availability of computer time creates this mode of working where you just have the idea and type it working where you just have an idea and type it and maybe erase it 10 times. Good Russian programmers, they tend to have had one experience as some time in the past, the experience of limited access of computer time. He returned for another round of Goldman grilling, which ended in the office of one high-frequency trader, another Russian named Alexander Davidovich. A managing director. He had just two final questions for Serge, both designed to test his ability to solve problems. The first, is 3,599 a prime number? Serge quickly saw there was something strange about 3,599. It was very close to 3,600. Jotted it down, the following equations. 3,599 equals 3,600 minus 1 equals 60 squared minus 1 squared equals 60 minus 1 times 60 plus 1 equals 59 times 61. No, not a prime number. The problem wasn't that difficult, but as he put it, it's harder to solve the problem when you're anticipated to solve it quickly. It might have taken him so long as 2 minutes to finish the second question. The Goldman director asked him was more involved and involving. He described for Serge a room, a rectangular box, and gave him its 3 dimensions. He says, there is a spider on the floor and gives me the coordinates. There's also a fly on the ceiling and gives me the coordinates as well. Then he asks the question, calculate the shortest distance a spider can take to reach the fly. The spider cannot fly or swing. It can only walk on surfaces. The shortest path between toe points was a straight line, and so Serge figured it was a matter of unfolding the box, turning a 3-dimensional object into a 1-dimensional surface, then using the Pythagorean theorem to calculate the distances. It took him several minutes to work it all out. When he was done, Davidovich offered him a job at Goldman Sachs. His starting salary plus bonus came to $270,000. He joined Goldman at an interesting moment in the history of both the firm and Wall Street. By mid-2007, Goldman's bond trading department was aiding and abetting a global financial crisis, most infamously by helping the Greek government to rig its books to disguise its debt, and by designing subprime mortgage securities to fail so they might make money by betting against them. At the same time, Goldman's equities department was adapting to radical challenges in the U.S. stock market. Just as the market was about to crash, a once sleepy oligopoly dominated by Nasdaq and the New York Stock Exchange was rapidly turning into something else. There were now 10 public stock exchanges in New Jersey alone, and trading the same stocks. Within a few years, there would be more than 40 dark pools of private exchanges, one of them owned by Goldman Sachs, also trading the same stock. Why the world needed 50 places, most of them in New Jersey, which to buy and sell shares of Apple Inc. is a question for another day. The fragmentation of American stock market was fueled in part by a rule created in 2007 by the SEC, the rule known inelegantly as Reg NMS, was designed to protect investors from their brokers. Instead, it wound up creating, as much rules often do, new ways of brokers to abuse their clients. Reg NMS requires stockbrokers to route their clients' orders to whichever exchange offers the best price. For example, if you tell Goldman Sachs broker to buy 1 million shares of Apple, and Apple shares are being offered at $400 a share and a Nasdaq 401 inside Goldman Sachs' dark pool, Goldman is now required to send your order to the first to Nasdaq. You'd think brokers might do that naturally to please their clients? Think again. For reasons not entirely obvious, yet another question for another day, the new rule stimulated a huge amount of stock market trading. Much of the new volume was generated not by old-fashioned investors, but by extremely fast computers controlled by high-frequency trading firms, like Getco and Citadel and D.E. Shaw and Renaissance Capital and high-frequency trading divisions of big Wall Street firms, especially Goldman Sachs. Essentially, the more places there were to trade stocks, the greater the opportunity there was for high-frequency traders to impose themselves between buyers and the one exchange of sellers to another. This was perverse. The initial promise of computer technology was to remove the intermediary from financial market, or at least reduce the amount it could scalp from that market. The reality, as it turned out to be a boom in the financial intermediation, was an estimate to take for Wall Street of some between 10 and 20 billion a year, depending on whose estimates you wish to believe. A high-frequency trading firm aren't required to disclose their profits, with the exception of public firms, like Knight, which have disclosed profits in the past, and big banks like Goldman that engage in the practice are assumed to be hiding their own profits on their balance sheet. No one ever really knows just how much money is being made. But when a single high-frequency trader is paid $75 million in cash for a single year of trading, as was Misha Malyshev in 2008 when he worked for Citadel, and then quits because he's dissatisfied, a new beast is afoot. The combination of new marketing rules and new technology was turning the stock market, in effect, a war of robots. The robots were absurdly fast and could execute tens of thousands of stock market transactions in a time it took a human trader to blink an eye. The games they played were often complicated, but one aspect of them was simple and clear. The faster robot was more likely to make more money and expense of a relatively both of others in the market. There was easy money to be made, for instance, from being able to respond more quickly than the rest of the market to changes in the supply and demand for a given stock. There was not so easy money to be made running crude strategies premised on the correlation between different securities. For example, assume a stock price of Coke and Pepsi tend to move up and down together. If you see Coke's stock popping higher and Pepsi was not yet responded, your robot might buy Pepsi before anyone else has processed what happened to Coke. At any rate, in 2008, from the point of view of Goldman Sachs, the good news was there were $1 billion of new dollars to be made by the stock market intermediaries. The bad news was Goldman Sachs wasn't yet making much of it, or they were doing a very good job of disguising its profits. At the end of that year, they informed their high-frequency trading computer programs that their trading unit had netted roughly $300 million. That same year, high-frequency trading vision on a single hedge fund, Citadel, made $1.2 billion. The headhunter who sat in the middle of the market and saw the firms were paying for geek talent says that Goldman had started to figure out, but they really hadn't figured out, they weren't top 10. The simple reason for this was that Goldman's robots were slow. A lot of the money-making strategies were a winner-take-all variety. When every player is trying to buy Pepsi after Coke stock popped, the player whose computers can take in data and spit out obvious responses to it first gets all the money. In the various races being run, Goldman was seldom first. That's why they had sought out Serge Aleynikov to improve the speed of their system. End of part 3. Tom Doody, middle-aged American living in New Jersey near the Lincoln Tunnel. If you were to visit my website, you would type Howdy Doody into Google. You'll find the correct spelling of the famous puppet. You then combine Tom Doody in a Google search for my site. Thank you for listening. Have a good day, good evening, or restful night's sleep. Ciao.